Alright, so it's been a little while since I've done one of these, but figured I found a few more things I wanted to talk about, so back with another one. Now, last time I talked about Aggron and about how you can use it to sort of stall out your opponent and set up walls and stuff like that. And one thing I forgot about and should have mentioned is Vibrava actually does all the same stuff Aggron does as well. Now it's a little bit different because Vibrava prevents attacking where Aggron forces an attack. But the example I gave where if you have two figures here and you have Aggron on the entry point, your opponent can't move through either one of these figures. And the same thing applies to Vibrava as well. So that's the same kind of play you can make with that. And Landorus, Therian form, actually does this as well because it prevents... It has the same effect where it prevents something from moving past it. So that was just something I forgot about and felt like I needed to mention. So I guess Aggron isn't quite as unique, and Vibrava is pretty much always going to be better. But, you know, like I mentioned, Aggron still has its own unique properties, you know, the Steel Z move, the Rock Z move, the Mega's ability, moving through stuff. So I still think Aggron has a decent amount of potential, but probably most people would pick Vibrava over Aggron anyway. But I'm not talking about Vibrava or Landorus today. I actually I recorded this episode Saturday, but ended up messing up part of the video. Like I switched to this scene and forgot to switch back to the board while I was drawing stuff on it. So hopefully I don't make that mistake today. But it was a much shorter episode, and I only talked about two things. I'm actually going to do this in a slightly different order today, but I'm going to talk about a figure and then also a plate at the end. And the figure I wanted to talk about today is Delphox. Now this figure, not many people used it. I think most of the people I saw using it, it was probably just one of the few EXs that they had. But SHD, if anybody watched his channel, it seemed like this may have been his favorite figure, and it's got a lot of uses, a lot of utility. I think this is mostly a utility figure. But so this is what we're talking about today. Now, the ability is sort of the main thing, but I'll go over that last. So first, let's talk about Delphox's wheel, and also its typing as well, I guess. So really, right off the bat, you can see it's got pretty low damage. Fire Blast being 140, that's not really enough to deal with most things. And Flamethrower being 80, this is fine. You know, you have one higher damage attack with Fire Blast, and then Flamethrower is there, which helps with Celebi or Mew. So you at least have the potential to deal with Celebi. Now, it wasn't too uncommon for people that were using Delphox to run it from breaks in, because it's not too difficult to evolve. Since Flame Kinesis is an effect that moves the opponent, if you can land that, then you evolve off of that, because you always evolve off of either a KO or if you move your opponent in some way. So Flame Kinesis was good for that, and it also, you know, had a decent matchup against Celebi for the same reason with the Flamethrower. And having that evolution is really beneficial for Delphox as well. It means your Fire Blast can do up to 160 if you're chain 10, which is okay. just okay. But the main thing on its wheel, and a pretty unique move, is Flame Kinesis. And having this at 3-star obviously is really beneficial, but the effect, the battle opponent is moved 3 steps away from this Pokemon. Now this is much stronger in terms of, well, maybe not necessarily stronger, but it's a much higher move count than most move effects. Usually you have stuff like Roar, where they move 1 step away. Maybe like Muddy Water moves 1 step away. Usually it's only 1 to 2 steps, but Flame Kinesis is 3. So it's a bit stronger in that regard. And this can actually help set up surrounds pretty easily, because this is an attack that doesn't just push forward. Like if Delphox is here, it doesn't just push the opponent in this direction or this direction. It's 3 steps away from Delphox, so it could even be thrown back here, here, anywhere 3 steps away. And so this means that it facilitates getting surrounds a lot easier. And also, you know, if Delphox is in the back and you land a Flame Kinesis, you toss something back here and you sort of prevent your opponent's approach. And it's also very good for sort of disrupting your opponent's position, because if you can essentially clog up your opponent's field. Like if you have some figures here, and you know your opponent is on this side as well, and Delphox is here and hits this figure with Flame Kinesis, you can throw it 1, 2, 3 steps here, and now your opponent has 2 figures sort of stuck together over here, and that's usually not favorable for the opponent. I mean, it depends on what they are, of course, but like I said, being able to sort of disrupt their positioning is incredibly useful. And as far as Z moves, the Fire Z move is, you know, pretty decent, being able to burn multiple stuff. It burns your own figures as well, because it doesn't discriminate between yours or your opponent's. But hey, spreading status is always nice, and burn is a pretty good status to have. But having Shattered Psyche does really help out Delphox as well, because now, even though it can't move through stuff, obviously having Shattered Psyche to just launch yourself from one side of the board to the other is always incredibly strong, and all psychic types benefit from that. But now, sort of the real draw of this Pokemon. The wheel is alright, and having Psychic Z move is good, but really you use Delphox for the ability. Magic Trick. If this Pokemon spins Miss in battle, one of your plates will switch from used to unused. Now it picks a random plate, so any of your plates that you've already used, and unless they've been like excluded from Naganadel or something, of course, any plate that's been used, including Mega plates, one of those will randomly turn unused. And this is very strong, very, very strong, because it's essentially, maybe not essentially, but getting plates back, sort of the most common way is to use Recycle, but Recycle costs 2 plate slots, and it takes your turn using Recycle. But Delphox, on the other hand, you just have to land a miss, and some people would actually run Delphox at level 1 to keep the maximum amount of miss. So it's a 16 at level 1, and if you reduce all the miss, it's minimum 8 at level 10. Or 9, I suppose. And that's perfectly fine, because I don't think you necessarily need to rely on this ability. I think it's just sort of something that's passive, and when it happens, good for you. But if it doesn't happen, you shouldn't rely on this ability, I suppose. But what is it good for? Obviously, having access to your plates again or more often are nice, but why? And I think probably the three, well, yeah, I guess I'll talk about 3 plates and what's the word? I'm talking about 3 plates. It's technically more than 3, but max revive, long throw, and mega plates, I think are the 3 things that you most likely want to bring back with Delphox's ability. So max revive is, I mean, it's probably about equal with mega plates in terms of the value you get bringing them back. So obviously, most of the time, most decks only run 1 max revive, which means you go down a figure, you use max revive to bring something back, maybe to either keep up advantage on the board or to protect your goal if your opponent is getting too close, or if there's a figure you really need, maybe your Dawn Wings gets knocked out and you need it back, you max revive. And being able to use max revive multiple times in a game is incredibly strong if your opponent is not able to, because for all those same reasons, but mostly keeping up advantage over your opponent. Because you always end up in a situation where you have 4 figures on the field, or maybe 1's on the bench, and 2 are in the PC, and your opponent will be in this position as well. And if you can max revive more times, then you're always going to be, well, almost always going to be ahead of your opponent in terms of how many figures you have on the board. And that's always way better, because it means you have more figures to Z-move with, more figures to surround with, more figures to block your opponent. Being able to max revive multiple times is incredibly strong. And the thing with mega plates is usually you want to be a little bit sparing with the mega plates. You either use it, maybe you have a Mega Lucario, you either use it to just take the entry point and threaten the goal, or maybe you need that big gold or the 2-star Aura Sphere for something, to take out something important. So usually you have to save your Mega for an important time like that, and so you usually don't burn your Mega early. When maybe you can get some advantage by using it early, but you choose not to because you want to have the Mega Plate for later, to take out the goalie or something like that. But Delphox allows you to, I mean, the same thing really, use the Mega Plate more often. And I ran Delphox for a little bit, and this was like 2018, I guess. And I ran it with Gengar and Mega Gengar. And so something I would do pretty often, and most people will do often with Gengar, is you bring Gengar out, you Mega, and you take the entry point immediately. And your opponent obviously has to block the goal. And if Gengar stays here, eventually the Mega is going to run out, because like I said, your opponent probably blocks. And now Gengar isn't really doing too much. And you've used up your Mega, now what is Gengar doing? But if you have Delphox, and this is a play that should be pretty common if you're using Delphox, I think you should always have a figure that can turn into a 3MP Mega if you're running Delphox. I mean, you don't have to, but this sets up this play where if your opponent's goalie is ever removed, they're probably not too worried about this now. If you've already used your Mega and you don't have the plate left, your opponent is thinking, okay, this is a Lucario or it's a Gengar or whatever. It can only move 2 steps, right? But if they're in this situation, they always have to be afraid that attacking your Delphox, wherever it is on the board, if it lands a miss and you get your Mega Plate back, they can lose off of that. Same thing I mentioned with Kyurem. um, is having things like this set up where your opponent is afraid to attack a specific figure. You know, it's similar. It's a, you know, less reliable than like Tapu Fini and Pony Wish, but it's similar to that. An Origin Pulse and Thousand Arrows from Zygarde, things like that, where your opponent has to think twice about attacking this figure because there could be a roll that just loses them the game. And something like that is always really strong. Because now, even if Delphox is kind of weak, and even if it's easily taken out, if you put yourself in a situation like this, it means that, you know, this figure now, your opponent should be afraid to attack into Delphox, which means now you're a little more free to do whatever else. Now, that's not always true, and, you know, obviously you're not always in a situation like this. But even if you're not, you still have, of course, the benefits of bringing back a Max Revive, maybe even getting extra Double Chance or an extra Ultra Burst. That's another thing, along with Mega Plates. And I mentioned Long Throw as well, mainly because it's the same thing with Long Throw. You typically save it, and well, you should save it for when you're in a situation like this. Your entry points are blocked and you have no option except to Long Throw, or sometimes you would use it to get a surround on something you need. But yeah, I'm saying the same thing over and over here, but really, the draw of Delphox and this ability, even though you're bringing back a random plate and you might not always get exactly what you want, just being able to get back a plate for free, essentially for free. The only cost is that you're playing Delphox in the deck, which is not a bad figure on its own. That's really strong, because I mean, this is obviously like, maybe you can compare it to Delibird, where when Delibird is knocked out, you get a Mega Plate back, but Delibird is an awful, awful figure, so it's never worth it, but Delphox is a decent figure, so it's always worth it, or well, pretty much always worth it. And you can kind of manipulate it. Maybe you use your plates a little bit sparingly, like you mega early game and then you play in a way where you don't need to use plates, like maybe you don't use a Max Revive right away or something. Because if you only have one plate used, then Delphox is always going to bring that plate back. So there's a bit of strategy with it as well, I suppose. Now, this is also the only thing, or the only way you can bring back a recycle plate as well. It's a little bit redundant to have Delphox and recycle, I think. But, you know, if you wanted to, Delphox can bring back a recycle plate as well. Like I said, that's probably not worth it. I think you would either use recycle or Delphox. Usually, I only saw recycle in Gardevoir decks because you want to be able to use your Altaria and your Gardevoir as much as possible, especially Altaria, because you know you can't always get the Mega knocked out. But yeah, I think that's about all I can say about Delphox. Just being able to bring back those plates like that is always strong, and you can set up a situation like this where your opponent's afraid to attack Delphox. Always good, and a very good figure, I think. I guess it's kind of in the same boat as Aggron, where you usually just pick something over it because other figures are just better in general. But Delphox is a really unique figure and has a strong effect, so definitely worth testing or trying out. Now, the other topic I wanted to cover is actually about a plate, and that plate being Golblock. So everyone knows what gold block does, and most people would use gold block. But I did see some people say, or I heard some people say things like, "Oh, if you use gold block, you're not as good as people who don't," or you know, I, there were some people that sort of advocated not using gold block, and how should I say this? I think people need to understand there's a time when you should and a time when you shouldn't run gold block, because there are some decks that don't need gold block. I think Rush doesn't really need gold block because you're always threatening your opponent and figures shouldn't be on your side of the board anyway. Plus you have Ponyta and Deoxys that can take the goal. And maybe like some hyper aggressive Mega Absol deck or something wouldn't need gold block. So like you don't have to run it, but I think if they were serious, I mean, I don't know how many people were, but people who dismissed gold block entirely, I think should maybe consider it a little bit more. So I wanted to talk about why gold block is good, or why it can be good. Now maybe maybe this is along the same lines as the Garchomp talk, where it's like, yeah, people know this, but I figured I would talk about it anyway. I wanted to talk about some plates eventually, and I think gold block is probably the best place I can start. Just because, like I said, I saw some people saying that, you know, they thought that they were better because they're not using gold block. Now, I do agree that if you're not using gold block, you do have to be a lot smarter. You have to be a bit more cautious and aware of everything. But just because you do use gold block doesn't mean you're not smart or you're not aware. So, just to start, well, I'll just read it. I always have to read stuff. Choose one of your Pokemon on the field and move it to your goal point if it is open. Your turn ends. So your goal point has to be clear, there can't be anything on it, and it has to be a figure on the field. That's fine. It would definitely be too strong, I think, if you could put something from your bench on it. But obviously the main point of this is to essentially just prevent you from losing. If you get in a situation where your goalie is knocked out, you bring something from somewhere else on the field and replace it. Simple as that, right? And you know, this is where some people would say, well, you know, if you were good at the game or if you were better at the game, you wouldn't have to gold block. And I can't really agree with that. So this is Pokemon Duel, right? Your figures spin, it's a roulette, really. And it's very common, you know, it can happen multiple times in a game where your goal is opened up by, you know, you're hit with a Twinkle Tackle, you're hit with an Aegislash from range, or you just get a really bad roll, you land that 4 miss. You know, anything can happen in Pokemon Duel, really. And having gold block to fall back on and sort of undo the tragedy that happens a lot in the game is pretty important, I think. Now, like I said, some decks don't really need that. If you have Ponyta, you can come out 4 steps, or and sometimes, excuse me. Sometimes there are figures that make really good goalies and are actually kind of difficult for your opponent to deal with, like putting a Dawnwings on the goal, putting a Primal Kyogre on the goal. You know, these are things that it takes your opponent usually 2 attacks to deal with, and they're just hard to KO in general. So they can sort of mitigate the need for gold block as well. But gold block the other thing I want to say about it is, and it's a little bit backwards, is using goal block aggressively, or using it to cover aggressive play, because it's pretty common for you to be in a situation where there are very few figures on the board, and I mean, maybe even like this, where your opponent's goal is open, even if it's not. If it's your turn in this situation, well, actually, no, this is better. If it's your turn in this situation, you can either start bringing something back to protect your goal, which admittedly is probably the best play. But if you have goal block, you actually have a pretty decent option here, or at least another decent option, and that's to attack this figure here. Now, if you don't have goal block, you definitely shouldn't do this, or you probably shouldn't, because this is kind of a win-lose situation. Maybe even if you're in this situation where it's a little more hopeless. Well, no, I'll leave it at that. Me and these examples. But if you attack this figure and you win this roll, you can probably win the game off of that. But if you lose this roll, your opponent can do the same thing, and you can essentially or potentially lose the game off of that as well. But having goal block opens up that play for you. Now, like I said, maybe this is a little bit risky anyway. It depends where everything else is. Like maybe you're in this situation where your opponent's board is mostly clear, and on your turn you decide to move up. No, sorry. I'll just put everything back where it was. Really, just what I'm trying to say is that having goal block means that you can make plays like this. You can make more plays because now you're not really afraid to do this anymore because you can fall back on goal block. And so this is kind of I guess a calculated risk, because maybe if you win this roll, maybe you win the game. Like perhaps it's even like this. Hold on, let's do. Let's do this, where your opponent has maybe a 2 MP figure here, and they're threatening to move here and take the goal in 2 turns. Well, no, because then you can just surround. Okay, sure. Sure. Sorry, my examples are always bad. That's the theme. But this situation as well. Maybe you have, maybe this is just like maybe you have a figure here, a 2 MP or even a 3 MP. I'm trying to just have 2 figures of yours on the board. I mean, there could be more, of course. But now in this situation, you can attack and do this here, or you can spend the time to bring something out. And maybe you're even in a situation where you can't bring something out, like maybe you've had some of your figures banished, or a figure on your bench has weight or something, and so now you're like, oh, I've got to move back with this, or with my 3 MP, because this figure is threatening to win in 2 turns. But if you have goal block, you can make this play now where you attack, and even if you don't win this roll, even if this figure is knocked out, or if it just stays on the board, now after they move up you can goal block. And without goal block, this is sort of just like a Hail Mary, where it's either you win this roll or you lose the game. But with goal block, maybe it's like, it's a little less risky then, because even if you lose this roll, you don't lose the game, is what I'm trying to say. Like I said, maybe it's probably unnecessary for me to talk about gold block like this, but I just wanted to bring it up because I don't think people should dismiss gold block entirely. Even if you are, extremely smart, you're extremely good at the game, you're like calculating what your opponent's going to do and planning to block everything correctly. Even if that happens, like I said, you can get really bad rolls. Anything can happen in Pokemon Duel. But the other thing is, and this ties in with playing aggressively with gold block, is that you have to guard a lot more if you don't have gold block, which means you spend more time reinforcing stuff back here and not pushing things forward, I think. That's not always true. And like always in Pokemon Duel, it depends on what figures you have, what the situation is like. A million different things can be happening. But I think most of the time, if you're not running gold block, well, let me clarify, because I think, like I said, if you're using a really aggressive deck and you're pretty much constantly putting your opponent on the back foot, then you don't need gold block. It's kind of just 2 plate slots that aren't doing too much, and sometimes you use it. But for an average deck, for a non hyper aggressive deck, even in Pokemon Duel, like outside of Rush, it's hard to be super aggressive. But for a standard deck, it's hard to always keep your opponent under pressure. And it's usually back and forth, so there's going to be times where you're under pressure, and if you don't have gold block, then you have to spend much more time building things up back here, and maybe you have to get a lucky roll to knock your opponent's figures out before you can catch a break and move up. But with gold block, maybe not exactly. I'm really sorry. I feel like I'm not doing a good job explaining this, and I'm like backpedaling. But now, if I have an extra figure on the board, maybe I can push it up this lane if it's open, instead of just, trying to guard my goal more. I guess that's all I'm trying to say. Sorry about that. I guess that's about it. I just wanted to say that I think gold block is more useful than some people will tell you. And it's not just a figure for a plate to make up for bad play. Because, like I said, even if you're playing 100% correctly, you make the right move every time, you're not going to get the right rolls all the time. And your opponent's going to get lucky, or they're just going to do something really weird that messes you up, or anything. Yeah, I guess I'm not going to repeat myself anymore. I think I said enough about it. But yeah, that's that. I don't know what other plates I can really talk about. I'll have to think about it. I mean, I think gold block is probably the one that I can give examples with the most. I mean, even this wasn't a whole lot. But stuff like Max Revive. Whoa, excuse me. Max Revive is sort of like self-explanatory. But I'll look over everything. Maybe there's something interesting to talk about. But otherwise, of course, there's always more figures. But I think that's it. Not really sure like how often I'll do these, like I said before, if I said it. It's just kind of whenever I feel like it, and just whenever something comes to mind. But yeah, doing these is really fun for me, so I'll definitely keep it up for a little while longer. But I think that's enough for this one, and I'll see you in the next.